What's the biggest global story that almost nobody is talking about? Story 1: the war in Sudan, which erupted in April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, has produced what the UN has repeatedly described as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. With displacement figures running into the millions and reports of ethnic-targeted violence in Darfur that human rights organizations have explicitly compared to the genocide of the early 2000s in the same region. Despite this scale, the conflict receives a fraction of the sustained international media attention given to comparably destructive wars elsewhere. What's made the war considerably harder to resolve, and arguably explains some of its persistence, is the documented involvement of external state actors backing opposing sides. The United Arab Emirates has been repeatedly linked, including through UN panel reporting, to supplying weapons and support to the Rapid Support Forces, while various reports have pointed to other regional powers maintaining relationships with the Sudanese armed forces, transforming what began as an internal power struggle between two military factions into something with the structural characteristics of a proxy conflict, where outside interests have incentive to see the war continue rather than resolve quickly. The threat of spillover into Ethiopia is genuinely significant given the region's existing fragility. Ethiopia has its own recent history of internal conflict, including the Tigray War, and the border regions between Sudan and Ethiopia already host significant refugee populations and contested territory, meaning a war already producing one of the world's largest displacement crises could plausibly destabilize an even wider swath of the Horn of Africa if containment efforts continue to fail. The disproportion between the war's actual humanitarian scale and its media coverage has become its own subject of commentary among aid organizations and journalists covering the region, who have repeatedly noted that a conflict displacing more people than Ukraine and Gaza combined struggles to maintain even a fraction of the sustained Western news attention those conflicts receive. Story 2: Cuba has experienced a severe and sustained fuel crisis driven by a combination of factors, including the long-standing U.S. trade embargo, the broader economic collapse of its primary historical benefactor relationships, and significant internal infrastructure failures, producing shortages severe enough that reports have described extended periods with minimal fuel deliveries reaching the island, crippling everything from public transportation to the agricultural machinery needed for food production. The downstream effects compound rapidly in a system this fragile. Fuel shortages don't just mean longer queues at petrol stations, they cascade directly into electricity generation, since much of Cuba's power grid depends on fuel-burning plants, producing extended, scheduled blackouts that have become a near-daily reality across large parts of the country. Agricultural production has been reported to fall dramatically as the diesel needed for tractors, irrigation pumps, and transport to market becomes unavailable, directly threatening the island's already constrained food security. Water treatment and pumping infrastructure, also fuel-dependent in many regions, has been affected similarly, raising genuine public health concerns around access to clean water. The geopolitical framing matters here too. Cuba sits roughly 90 miles from the Florida coast, making a severe, sustained humanitarian collapse there a matter of direct and immediate relevance to U.S. migration policy. Regional stability and historical Cold War-era political sensitivities that still shape how this crisis gets discussed, or more often, doesn't get discussed, in American media. The disconnect between the severity of what's being reported by aid organizations and Cuban civil society and its actual visibility in mainstream international news coverage is itself part of the story. A genuine humanitarian emergency unfolding at the doorstep of one of the world's most media-saturated countries, receiving a small fraction of the coverage that crises of comparable severity elsewhere typically generate. Story 3: Biodiversity loss generally gets occasional coverage when it involves charismatic species, polar bears, elephants, coral reefs. But the decline of insect populations specifically has been documented by multiple independent long-term studies as one of the most severe and consequential biodiversity losses currently occurring, and it remains dramatically under-discussed relative to its actual ecological significance. The most widely cited research includes a 2017 German study that found a 75% decline in flying insect biomass across protected nature reserves over roughly 27 years. A result that stunned researchers, specifically because it occurred in areas that were supposedly protected from the most direct human disturbance. Subsequent studies across multiple countries and ecosystems have found broadly similar, alarming trends, though the precise rate and geographic consistency of decline remains an active area of scientific debate and ongoing measurement. Since comprehensive historical insect population data is genuinely difficult to establish for a category of organism this numerous and diverse. The reason this matters disproportionately to its public profile is structural. Insects pollinate the substantial majority of global food crops, form the base of food webs supporting birds, fish, and countless other species, and perform essential ecosystem functions including decomposition and soil health maintenance that most people never think about until they fail. A collapse in insect populations doesn't produce a single dramatic, photographable moment the way a wildfire or a flood does. It produces a slow, cumulative unraveling of ecological systems that becomes visible mainly through second-order effects, like declining bird populations or crop pollination failures, well after the underlying insect decline has been underway for years. The leading suspected drivers, habitat loss, pesticide use, climate change, and light pollution, are also each individually significant ongoing global issues, which makes insect decline simultaneously a consequence of several other under-addressed environmental problems and a slow-motion crisis in its own right. Story 4: Ocean acidification gets discussed far less than atmospheric warming, despite being driven by the exact same root cause and posing comparably severe long-term risks, which makes it one of the clearest examples of a genuinely major global story, receiving a fraction of the attention its scale would seem to warrant. The mechanism is straightforward chemistry. The ocean absorbs roughly a quarter to a third of all human-emitted atmospheric carbon dioxide, and when CO2 dissolves into seawater, it undergoes a chemical reaction that produces carbonic acid, gradually lowering the ocean's pH. This isn't a future projection. It's measured, ongoing change. Ocean surface pH has already declined by approximately 0.1 units since the start of the industrial era, which sounds small but represents, because pH is measured on a logarithmic scale, roughly a 30% increase in actual ocean acidity. The biological consequences are severe specifically for organisms that build calcium carbonate shells or skeletons, a category that includes coral reefs, many species of plankton that form the base of marine food webs, shellfish, including oysters and mussels, and various other foundational marine species. Acidified water makes it measurably harder for these organisms to build and maintain their calcium carbonate structures, and in sufficiently acidified conditions, existing shells and skeletal structures can begin actively dissolving. Coral reefs, already under severe stress from warming-driven bleaching events, face acidification as a genuinely compounding, independent threat operating through an entirely different chemical mechanism. Because this process plays out gradually across the entire global ocean rather than producing a single dramatic localized event, it lacks the kind of visual, immediate news hook that drives sustained media coverage, even though the long-term threat to global marine food webs and the hundreds of millions of people who depend on seafood for protein is genuinely severe and well documented by marine chemists and biologists who have been tracking it for decades. Story 5: The Panama Papers leak in 2016 was, at the time, treated as a genuinely seismic event. 11.5 million leaked documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca, exposing the offshore financial dealings of numerous world leaders, public officials, and wealthy individuals across dozens of countries, coordinated through a massive collaborative investigation by the international consortium. of investigative journalists, involving hundreds of journalists worldwide. The immediate fallout included the resignation of Iceland's prime minister and significant political pressure on leaders in multiple other countries. What's genuinely notable, and what this question is really pointing toward, is how comparatively little structural change actually followed an exposure of this scale. Some individual prosecutions did occur in various countries, and some governments implemented modest reforms to beneficial ownership disclosure requirements. But the fundamental offshore financial architecture the leak exposed, the global network of shell companies, tax havens, and jurisdictions specifically structured to obscure beneficial ownership of assets and income, remains substantially intact and operational years later. And subsequent leaks, including the Paradise Papers and Pandora Papers, have continued to expose broadly similar practices involving largely overlapping categories of wealthy and powerful individuals. This pattern, a major leak generating intense but ultimately short-lived media attention, followed by limited structural reform and a fairly rapid return to business as usual, has become a recurring feature of offshore financial leak journalism specifically, and it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about the actual capacity of investigative journalism, even at the scale and coordination level the Panama Papers achieved, to produce lasting systemic change against entrenched, well-resourced, and politically connected financial interests. The original Mossack Fonseca firm itself was eventually shut down in 2018, but the broader offshore industry the firm represented continues operating through other providers in other jurisdictions, largely unchanged in its fundamental function. Story 6: NASA is going to crash the International Space Station into the ocean, and almost nobody has noticed NASA has confirmed through official planning documents that the International Space Station, humanity's largest and longest continuously inhabited space structure, a collaborative project involving the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada that has hosted continuous human presence since November 2000, is scheduled to be deliberately deorbited toward the end of the current decade, with a controlled descent planned to bring the bulk of the structure down into a remote, unpopulated stretch of the Pacific Ocean, in the area sometimes informally called the Spacecraft Cemetery, where numerous previous decommissioned satellites and space station components have similarly been directed. The scale of what's actually being decommissioned is difficult to fully appreciate without comparison. The IS is approximately the size of a football field, represents an investment of well over $150 billion across its international partner nations, and has been continuously crewed and operational for over 2 decades. Longer than many of the people who will watch news coverage of its destruction have been alive. The reasoning behind decommissioning rather than indefinite continued operation involves genuine, serious engineering concerns. The station's structure was originally designed with a more limited operational lifespan in mind, and components have shown increasing signs of wear, including documented air leaks in certain modules that have required ongoing monitoring and mitigation. NASA's stated plan involves transitioning low Earth orbit operations to commercial space stations currently in development by private companies, representing a genuinely significant structural shift in how human presence in low Earth orbit gets managed going forward, moving from a government-led international collaborative model toward a commercially operated one. Given the IS's symbolic significance as one of the most successful examples of sustained international scientific cooperation in modern history, the comparatively muted public attention this planned, deliberate destruction has received is genuinely striking. Story 7: The AMIC is weakening, and climate scientists are increasingly worried about a point of no return. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMIC for short, is the system of ocean currents, including what's commonly known as the Gulf Stream, that transports warm water from the tropics northward through the Atlantic and circulates cold, dense water back south at depth, functioning as one of the most significant heat redistribution systems on the entire planet and playing a major role in regulating climate patterns across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. multiple independent studies using different methodologies, including reconstructions based on ocean sediment cores and direct, ongoing measurement through dedicated monitoring arrays in the Atlantic, have found evidence that AMOC circulation strength has weakened measurably over recent decades and is currently at its weakest point in over a millennium, according to several reconstructions. The mechanism driving this weakening is connected directly to climate change. Melting ice sheets, particularly from Greenland, introduce large volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic, and fresh water is less dense than salt water, disrupting the density-driven sinking process that drives the entire circulation system in the first place. What makes this genuinely alarming to climate scientists specifically is the possibility of a tipping point, a threshold beyond which the circulation could shift relatively abruptly into a substantially weaker or even collapsed state, rather than continuing to decline gradually and predictably. Some climate scientists have published research suggesting this tipping point could plausibly be reached within the next few decades under continued high-emission scenarios, though significant scientific uncertainty remains around the exact timing and probability. The potential consequences of AMOC collapse are genuinely severe and far-reaching. Significantly colder average temperatures across northern Europe despite overall global warming, disrupted monsoon patterns affecting agriculture across multiple continents, and accelerated sea level rise specifically along the U.S. East Coast. This represents exactly the kind of slow building, scientifically serious, genuinely civilization-relevant risk that receives a small fraction of the sustained public attention its potential consequences would warrant. Story 8 Ebola is spreading again in the Darfur and Rwanda, and coverage has been minimal. Ebola outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of Congo have occurred with disturbing regularity over the past decade, and the disease's continued presence in the region, including documented spread affecting neighboring Rwanda, represents an ongoing public health threat that receives a small fraction of the sustained media coverage the 2014-2016 West African Ebola epidemic generated, despite the disease's continued severity and the genuine, demonstrated risk of broader regional or even international spread if containment efforts fail. The Democratic Republic of Congo has experienced multiple distinct Ebola outbreaks since 2018 alone, occurring against a backdrop of ongoing armed conflict in the eastern regions of the country that has repeatedly complicated public health response efforts. Healthcare workers attempting to conduct contact tracing, vaccination campaigns, and treatment have faced direct security threats in conflict-affected areas, and displacement caused by ongoing fighting has repeatedly undermined the kind of stable population tracking that effective outbreak containment requires. What's changed favorably since the 2014-2016 epidemic is the development and deployment of genuinely effective Ebola vaccines, which have substantially improved containment capability and reduced fatality rates in subsequent outbreaks compared to the pre-vaccine era. This medical progress is genuinely significant and represents one of public health's clearer recent success stories. But vaccine availability and effective deployment still depend heavily on functioning healthcare infrastructure and security conditions that remain severely compromised in the specific regions where outbreaks keep recurring, meaning the underlying structural vulnerability that allows Ebola to keep re-emerging in this particular region hasn't actually been resolved, even as the tools to fight individual outbreaks have improved. The relative international media silence around recurring Ebola outbreaks in Central Africa, compared to the intense, sustained global attention the 2014 epidemic generated once it reached countries with larger international media presence and travel connections, reflects a broader and well-documented pattern in how global health crises receive attention based substantially on their geographic and political proximity to wealthy media markets, rather than purely on their actual severity or human cost. Story 9, the sand mafia is stripping beaches and riverbeds faster than the planet can replace them. Sand is after water, the most extracted natural resource on Earth by volume, consumed in enormous quantities by the global construction industry for concrete production, and the world is genuinely approaching meaningful supply constraints for the specific type of sand construction actually requires. A fact that receives remarkably little public attention, given the resource's fundamental role in nearly all modern infrastructure and building. The specific qualifier matters here. Not all sand is interchangeable for construction purposes. Desert sand, despite its apparent abundance, is generally unsuitable for concrete production because wind erosion produces grains too smooth and rounded to bind effectively in concrete mixtures, which require the rougher, more angular grains typically found in riverbed, lakebed, and certain coastal sand deposits. This means the specific sand resources construction actually depends on are considerably more geographically limited and genuinely depletable than the popular conception of sand is everywhere intuition would suggest. The criminal dimension of this story is genuinely significant and well documented by investigative journalists across multiple countries, particularly in South and Southeast Asia and parts of Africa. Organized criminal networks, sometimes referred to as sand mafias, have been documented engaging in large-scale illegal sand extraction from rivers, beaches, and protected coastal areas, often through violence and intimidation against local communities and environmental enforcement officials. With documented cases of journalists and activists investigating illegal sand mining being threatened, attacked, or killed in multiple countries, including India, where the issue has received the most sustained domestic investigative coverage. The environmental consequences extend beyond simple resource depletion. Illegal and unregulated sand extraction from riverbeds and coastlines causes documented erosion, disrupts local ecosystems, undermines bridge and infrastructure foundations that depend on stable riverbed structure, and in coastal areas can actively increase vulnerability to flooding and storm surge by removing natural buffer. Sediment, compounding climate-driven coastal risks that are already increasing independently. Story 10: The UK's plan to install surveillance capability on every phone. Proposals and legislative efforts in the United Kingdom around expanding government access to encrypted communications and device data have drawn comparatively limited international attention relative to the scale of digital privacy implications involved. Despite the UK's status as a major Western democracy, whose policy decisions in this area frequently influence broader international conversations around encryption, surveillance, and digital privacy regulation, the core tension at the center of proposals like this involves the UK government's stated interest in maintaining law enforcement and intelligence access to encrypted communications and personal device data for purposes including counter-terrorism and child safety investigations, weighed against the technical reality that genuinely secure end-to-end encryption, the kind that protects ordinary users' private communications, banking information, and personal data from criminals and hostile state actors, cannot, according to the consistent and repeated assessment of cryptography and computer security experts, be selectively weakened or backdoored for government access without fundamentally compromising security for all users, including the law-abiding majority the system is also meant to protect. This isn't a uniquely British policy debate. Versions of this same encryption access tension have recurred repeatedly across multiple democracies, including ongoing debates in the United States, Australia, and the European Union. What makes the UK's specific legislative and regulatory approach noteworthy is the country's particular combination of an unusually extensive existing surveillance legal framework built up substantially since the Investigatory Powers Act and its predecessor, and its position as a jurisdiction that major global technology companies, including Apple, have had to directly respond to, including documented instances of companies withdrawing or modifying specific security features for UK users rather than comply with certain access requirements, a response that itself illustrates the genuine practical stakes involved. The relatively limited mainstream coverage of these ongoing developments, compared to their potential implications for the security and privacy of tens of millions of device users, reflects how genuinely difficult technical and legal policy stories around encryption tend to struggle for sustained public attention compared to more visually or emotionally immediate news. Story 11, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, keeps growing, and most people still don't understand what it actually is. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is genuinely well known by name, but the actual scale, composition, and ongoing trajectory of the problem remains widely misunderstood, even among people who've heard the term repeatedly, which makes it a useful entry for this kind of list, not unknown, but genuinely underexplained relative to how often it's casually referenced. The patch is not, despite the popular mental image many people carry, a solid, walkable island of floating trash. It's a vast region of the North Pacific Ocean, located between Hawaii and California, where ocean currents converge and concentrate floating debris, predominantly microplastics. Plastic fragments broken down by sun and wave action into pieces, often smaller than a fingernail, distributed throughout the water column rather than sitting visibly on the surface, which is part of why the reality is considerably less visually dramatic and considerably harder to simply scoop up and remove than popular imagery suggests. The patch's actual measured area varies considerably depending on methodology and which concentration threshold researchers use to define its boundaries. But multiple research expeditions and ongoing monitoring have found it to be genuinely enormous, with some estimates placing it at roughly 3 times the size of France, composed of an estimated trillions of individual plastic pieces. Fishing gear specifically, nets, lines, and other equipment, often abandoned or lost at sea, has been found through extensive sampling expeditions to constitute a surprisingly large proportion of the patch's total mass, complicating the popular assumption that consumer plastic waste alone is the primary driver. Cleanup efforts, including the Ocean Cleanup Organization's deployed collection systems, have made measurable but genuinely modest progress relative to the patch's total scale and the continued, ongoing rate of new plastic debris entering the ocean globally, which continues to outpace current removal capacity by a significant margin, meaning the patch has continued growing even as cleanup technology and public awareness have both genuinely improved over the past decade. Story 12, groundwater is disappearing, and it's not coming back the way reservoirs refill. Groundwater depletion is a genuinely distinct and arguably more severe category of water crisis than the drought conversations that typically dominate public discussion, precisely because of a critical distinction most people don't fully appreciate. Surface water systems, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, generally refill relatively quickly once rainfall patterns normalize, while many of the world's major underground aquifer systems took thousands to tens of thousands of years to accumulate their current water reserves and are being drained by modern agricultural and municipal pumping at rates dramatically faster than natural recharge can replace. Satellite gravity measurement data, collected through NASA's GRACE mission and its successor, has provided genuinely alarming, precise documentation of this depletion across multiple major global aquifer systems. The Ogallala Aquifer, underlying significant portions of American agricultural production in the Great Plains, has shown substantial, measurable long-term decline in several heavily farmed regions. Northern India's groundwater systems, supporting one of the most agriculturally intensive and densely populated regions on the planet, have shown some of the most severe documented depletion rates globally. Similar patterns have been documented across parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and northern China. The not drought, not take shorter showers framing in this entry captures something genuinely important about why this issue is so chronically under-discussed relative to its severity. Groundwater depletion isn't primarily driven by individual household water consumption, which is a comparatively small fraction of total water use in most affected regions, but by industrial-scale agricultural irrigation, which accounts for the overwhelming majority of groundwater extraction globally. This means the typical individual conservation messaging that dominates public water awareness campaigns largely misses the actual structural driver of the crisis, while the agricultural and policy level changes that would actually address the problem. Water pricing reform, crop selection shifts, irrigation efficiency mandates are politically and economically considerably more difficult to implement and correspondingly receive far less public attention or political momentum. Story 13: Poverty. The crisis so large and so constant that it stopped being treated as news. There's something genuinely revealing about poverty appearing on a list of stories almost nobody is talking about. Because global poverty is in one sense discussed constantly, it's referenced in development reports, charity appeals, and political rhetoric with enormous regularity. And yet, in the sense that actually matters for sustained public attention and political pressure towards systemic solutions, this response is pointing at something real. Poverty as an ongoing, structural global emergency rarely receives the kind of urgent, headline-driving coverage that comparably severe but more acute crises generate. The actual scale remains genuinely staggering. The World Bank's international poverty measurements, while methodologically contested in various ways, consistently place hundreds of millions of people in conditions of extreme poverty globally, with billions more living in circumstances of significant material deprivation that fall short of the most extreme threshold, but still represent severe, ongoing hardship, inadequate access to healthcare, education, clean water, and basic nutrition security as persistent, daily realities rather than emergency conditions requiring acute response. This is precisely the structural reason poverty struggles for sustained media attention compared to acute crises. News coverage, by its fundamental nature, tends to favor discrete, datable events with clear before and after states: a war breaking out, a disaster striking, an outbreak beginning, over chronic, ongoing conditions that, however severe, don't have a clean narrative arc of a specific moment when things changed. Poverty has been a constant, severe global condition for the entirety of recorded human history, which paradoxically makes it harder to cover as news, precisely because it isn't new. Genuine, well-documented progress has occurred. Extreme poverty rates have declined substantially over recent decades on a percentage basis, driven significantly by economic development in parts of Asia specifically. But the persistence of poverty at the scale it continues to exist, combined with its low salience as an ongoing news story relative to its actual human cost, makes this a genuinely defensible answer to what's chronically under-discussed. Story 14: The claim that an AI model was pulled by the US government. What's actually verified here? This entry deserves careful, honest treatment specifically, because it's the kind of claim that circulates readily in online spaces, without the kind of verification that would let anyone confidently report it as established fact. And it's worth being transparent about that distinction, rather than repeating an unconfirmed claim as though it were settled. There is no current, publicly documented, independently verified case of a major AI model being deliberately and specifically pulled by the US government in the dramatic sense this claim implies. A forced removal from public availability ordered by federal authorities for reasons withheld from the public. What does exist, and what may be the actual underlying basis for claims like this circulating online, is a considerably more mundane and well-documented reality. AI companies do periodically deprecate, restrict, or modify model availability for a wide range of entirely ordinary commercial and technical reasons, including replacing older models with newer versions, addressing discovered safety or capability issues identified through their own internal testing and red teaming processes, or responding to specific identified misuse patterns. There is also a genuine, actively evolving regulatory and national security conversation happening around AI specifically. Export controls on advanced AI chips, government scrutiny of AI capabilities with potential dual-use military or security applications, and ongoing policy debate about appropriate government oversight of frontier AI development. This real regulatory context is exactly the kind of environment in which a more dramatic, specific, but unverified rumor about a government-ordered model removal could plausibly take root and spread, borrowing genuine institutional anxiety and regulatory uncertainty as cover for a more specific claim that doesn't actually have confirmed, sourced evidence behind it? The honest, responsible answer here is that this specific claim, as stated, isn't something that can be verified or reported as fact based on current public, sourced information, and treating it that way is itself worth modeling, particularly on a list explicitly about which stories deserve more scrutiny and attention. Story 15: UFO and UAP sightings are being reported at genuinely unusual rates right now. Unidentified anomalous phenomena, the term that substantially replaced UFO in official government and military usage in recent years. Reporting has increased measurably according to multiple official sources, and the shift in institutional posture toward taking these reports seriously, rather than dismissing them outright, represents a genuinely significant and under-discussed change from the historical pattern of official UFO-related communication. The Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, established specifically to investigate and catalog UAP reports across military branches, has published periodic reports documenting hundreds of new reported incidents annually from military pilots and other credentialed observers. A volume that represents official military personnel formally reporting unexplained aerial phenomena at a rate that would have seemed institutionally unthinkable even a decade ago, when such reports were widely understood to carry genuine career risk for the reporting service members involved. Congressional engagement with this topic has similarly escalated in ways that received less sustained mainstream coverage than the topic's genuine novelty would suggest. Multiple congressional hearings, including testimony under oath from credentialed former intelligence and military officials, have occurred specifically addressing UAP phenomena and, in some cases, more extraordinary claims about government retrieval and reverse engineering programs. Claims that remain entirely unverified by independent evidence, but that are now being made through formal legal channels carrying genuine legal consequences for false testimony, which is a meaningfully different category of claim than the same allegations made informally. What's genuinely under-discussed here isn't necessarily the extraordinary claims themselves, which do receive periodic viral media attention, but the more mundane, equally significant institutional shift underlying them. The U.S. government has moved, within a remarkably short time frame, from a posture of dismissal and ridicule toward UAP reporting to one of formal, funded, sustained investigation and congressional oversight. A genuine change in institutional behavior that's arguably more significant and considerably less covered in its own right than any individual sighting or claim circulating at any given moment. Story 16: The unregulated deep-sea mining gold rush nobody voted on has demand for the specific metals required for batteries and renewable energy infrastructure, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earth elements among them, continues accelerating. Mining companies have increasingly turned attention toward the deep ocean floor, where vast fields of polymetallic nodules, naturally formed mineral deposits scattered across abyssal plains, contain commercially significant concentrations of exactly these metals, and the regulatory framework governing this entirely new extractive industry remains genuinely underdeveloped relative to the speed at which commercial interest is advancing. The International Seabed Authority, the UN-affiliated body tasked with regulating mineral-related activities in international waters beyond any single nation's jurisdiction, has issued numerous exploration licenses to various companies and state-affiliated entities over recent years, while the actual binding regulatory framework governing commercial-scale extraction, the rules that would determine environmental protection standards, revenue sharing, and oversight mechanisms, has remained in a state of prolonged, contested negotiation, creating a genuine regulatory gap in which exploration and preparatory activity has substantially outpaced the rules meant to govern eventual full-scale operations. The environmental stakes are genuinely significant and poorly understood, which is itself part of the problem. The deep ocean floor hosts ecosystems that scientists are still in the relatively early stages of cataloging, including species found nowhere else, and the nodule fields themselves take millions of years to form, meaning any mining-related disturbance to these deposits, and the surrounding seafloor ecosystem would be, for all practical human timescale purposes, permanent and irreversible. Several marine biology research expeditions specifically studying these regions have documented surprising levels of biodiversity in areas previously assumed to be relatively barren, complicating industry arguments that deep-sea mining represents a lower-impact alternative to terrestrial mining. Several countries, along with major corporations including some automakers committed to reducing their environmental supply chain impact, have called for moratoriums on deep-sea mining pending more rigorous environmental assessment. But commercial and national strategic mineral security pressure continues building in the opposite direction, largely outside sustained public attention. Story 17, the corporate enclosure of the human genome. Who actually owns pieces of you? The question of whether and how private companies can claim intellectual property rights over portions of the human genome has been an active, legally and ethically significant battleground for decades, and the current state of genomic patent law, shaped substantially by a series of major court decisions but still containing genuine ongoing ambiguity, represents a genuinely under-discussed aspect of how modern biotechnology and genetic medicine actually operate commercially. The landmark 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Association for Molecular Pathology v. Myriad Genetics established that naturally occurring human gene sequences, simply as discovered and isolated, cannot be patented, directly invalidating patents Myriad Genetics had previously held over the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes associated with breast and ovarian cancer risk. Patents the company had used to maintain a near-exclusive commercial position on BRCA genetic testing, at prices significantly higher than testing became after the ruling opened the field to competition. What the ruling specifically did not prohibit, and what continues to drive substantial ongoing commercial activity in this space, is patenting synthetic, modified, or specifically engineered genetic sequences and applications, meaning companies can still obtain meaningful intellectual property protection over genetically modified sequences. Specific diagnostic methods and techniques for analyzing genetic information, CRISPR-based gene editing tools and applications, and numerous other genuinely significant commercial angles on genetic technology that fall outside the narrower, naturally occurring sequence prohibition the Myriad ruling established. This creates a genuinely complex ongoing landscape where the foundational biological information itself, your actual genetic sequence, cannot be privately owned, but an enormous and continuously expanding body of methods, modifications, and applications built around interpreting, editing, and using that information very much can be, and increasingly is, concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of well-resourced biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies, raising genuine, under-discussed questions about equitable access to the medical benefits of genomic research as the technology continues advancing rapidly. Story 18, the Dark Fleet. The shadow tanker network laundering sanctioned oil in response to international sanctions targeting oil exports from countries including Russia and Iran, a substantial and well-documented network of tankers, collectively referred to by maritime analysts and journalists as the Dark Fleet or Shadow Fleet, has emerged specifically to circumvent these restrictions, transporting sanctioned oil through a combination of techniques designed to obscure the cargo's true origin, ownership, and destination. And the scale of this network has grown to a point where maritime security analysts now estimate it comprises a meaningful fraction of the entire global tanker fleet. The operational techniques involved are genuinely sophisticated and well documented through satellite tracking and maritime intelligence analysis. Ships frequently disable or manipulate their automatic identification system transponders, equipment legally required for maritime safety that broadcasts a vessel's identity and location to obscure their actual movements during sanctioned cargo transport. Ship-to-ship transfers, conducted at sea away from port oversight, are used to blend sanctioned cargo with legitimate oil, obscuring its true origin before it reaches its eventual buyer. Ownership structures for these vessels are frequently routed through complex layers of shell companies registered in jurisdictions with minimal transparency requirements, making genuine beneficial ownership extremely difficult to establish even for investigators specifically focused on the problem. The vessels involved are also frequently older, less well-maintained ships operating with reduced insurance coverage or no legitimate international insurance at all, which creates a genuine and growing environmental risk dimension to this story beyond the sanctions evasion angle alone. A serious spill or maritime accident involving an uninsured dark fleet tanker could produce a major environmental disaster with limited or no clear mechanism for cleanup funding or liability enforcement, since the ownership structure is specifically designed to obscure exactly the kind of accountability that would normally apply. The scale of this network and its direct relevance to ongoing major geopolitical sanctions regimes makes it a genuinely significant and undercovered story relative to its actual economic and environmental stakes. Story 19: The Phantom Electronics Deficit. Counterfeit components hiding inside critical infrastructure. The global electronics supply chain contains a genuinely significant and persistent problem with counterfeit components. Chips and parts that are either entirely fake, recycled from discarded electronics and fraudulently relabeled as new, or genuine components that have been altered or substituted in ways that compromise their actual specifications, entering legitimate supply chains and ending up embedded in equipment ranging from consumer electronics to, more alarmingly, military and critical infrastructure systems. Government audits and industry investigations, including specific U.S. Department of Defense supply chain reviews, have documented confirmed instances of counterfeit electronic components discovered in military equipment, an outcome that's genuinely concerning given that components failing to meet their claimed specifications can introduce reliability failures or security vulnerabilities into systems where failure carries serious consequences, whether that's a malfunctioning component in a weapon system or a compromised chip in critical civilian infrastructure like power grid control systems. The scale of the problem is driven by the genuine complexity and globalized nature of modern electronics manufacturing. A single sophisticated device might contain components sourced through dozens of different suppliers and intermediaries across multiple countries, creating numerous points in the supply chain where counterfeit or substituted components can be introduced without easy detection, particularly as counterfeiting techniques have become increasingly sophisticated, sometimes producing components that pass basic visual and even some functional inspection, while still failing to meet the reliability and performance specifications of genuine parts. Industry and government responses have included expanded component testing requirements, blockchain-based supply chain tracking pilots intended to create verifiable provenance records, and increased domestic manufacturing incentives specifically intended to reduce dependence on the longer, harder-to-verify international supply chains where counterfeiting risk is highest. But the fundamental economic incentives driving counterfeiting, genuine components, are expensive, and counterfeits are profitable specifically because they're difficult to detect, remain largely unaddressed at a structural level, meaning this represents an ongoing, largely invisible vulnerability running through systems that society depends on functioning reliably. Story 20: The Internet's Undersea Cable Choke Points. How fragile the whole system actually is. The vast majority of international internet traffic, by most estimates, well over 95% of intercontinental data, travels not through satellites, as popular imagination sometimes assumes, but through a global network of undersea fiber optic cables. And the genuine physical vulnerability of this critical infrastructure, concentrated at a relatively small number of geographic choke points, represents a significant and surprisingly under-discussed strategic and economic risk. These cables are physically vulnerable to a range of threats that have become increasingly salient in recent years. Anchor drags from ships, including documented and strongly suspected deliberate sabotage incidents in regions including the Baltic Sea, where multiple cable damage incidents in recent years have prompted formal NATO and EU security investigations and heightened naval patrol presence specifically intended to protect this infrastructure. Natural disasters, including underwater earthquakes and volcanic activity, have also caused significant documented cable damage and resulting internet disruption in various regions, sometimes affecting entire countries' international connectivity for extended repair periods. The choke point concentration is what makes this risk genuinely structural, rather than simply diffuse. Certain narrow maritime corridors, including specific stretches near Egypt connecting European and Asian cable routes, carry a disproportionately large share of total global intercontinental data traffic through a relatively small number of physical cable bundles, meaning damage concentrated at these specific points has outsized potential to disrupt global connectivity well beyond what the actual physical area affected might suggest. Cable repair itself is a genuinely specialized and limited global capability. There are a relatively small number of specialized cable repair ships worldwide capable of conducting deep-sea cable repair operations, creating a real bottleneck if multiple significant cable damage incidents occurred simultaneously or in rapid succession, a scenario that maritime security analysts increasingly consider a genuine, serious vulnerability given documented patterns of suspected deliberate cable damage incidents in geopolitically tense regions over recent years. Story 21, the phosphate depletion countdown. The fertilizer crisis almost nobody is watching. Phosphorus is one of the essential nutrients required for plant growth, and modern industrial agriculture depends overwhelmingly on phosphate rock mining to produce the phosphate fertilizers that sustain current global food production levels. And unlike nitrogen, which can be synthetically fixed from the atmosphere through the energy-intensive but essentially unlimited Haber-Bosch process, phosphorus has no equivalent synthetic production pathway, meaning the global food system's phosphorus supply is directly and permanently dependent on a genuinely finite, geologically concentrated mineral resource. Phosphate rock reserves are also geographically concentrated to a striking degree. A small number of countries, with Morocco holding a particularly dominant position due to its control of the Western Sahara phosphate deposits, account for the overwhelming majority of global reserves, creating a genuine long-term resource security concern that's structurally similar to historical anxieties around oil dependency, but applied to a resource with no viable synthetic substitute and direct, fundamental relevance to whether global food production can be sustained at current levels. Estimates of exactly how many decades of currently accessible, economically extractable phosphate reserves remain vary considerably depending on assumptions about future extraction technology, demand growth, and what counts as economically accessible at various future price points. And this genuine uncertainty has itself contributed to the issue's relatively low public profile, since there's no single, confidently agreed upon, we have exactly X years left figure that would generate the kind of urgent headline coverage more clearly quantified crises tend to receive. What makes this genuinely under-discussed relative to its long-term stakes is the disconnect between phosphorus's almost complete invisibility in everyday consumer awareness. Virtually nobody thinks about phosphate rock when they're eating, and its absolutely foundational role in sustaining the fertilizer-dependent agricultural systems that current global food security, for a population approaching 8 billion people, fundamentally relies upon continuing to function. Story 22 GPS spoofing is already affecting commercial aviation, and it's getting worse. GPS spoofing, the deliberate transmission of false GPS signals designed to deceive a receiver into calculating an incorrect position, as opposed to GPS jamming, which simply blocks signal reception entirely, has emerged as a documented, escalating problem specifically affecting commercial aviation in several regions, particularly around active conflict zones, and the scale and frequency of confirmed incidents has increased substantially in recent years without generating coverage proportional to the genuine safety implications involved. Aviation safety organizations and individual airlines have documented and reported numerous specific incidents, concentrated heavily in regions including the Middle East and parts of Eastern Europe near active conflict areas, where commercial aircraft navigation systems have received GPS signals indicating positions significantly different from the aircraft's actual location, sometimes by tens or even hundreds of miles, creating genuine navigational confusion for flight crews who depend on GPS data as a core input for modern flight management systems. The most plausible explanation for the geographic concentration of these incidents, according to aviation security analysts, points toward military electronic warfare systems deployed by state actors specifically intended to disrupt drone navigation, missile guidance, or other military GPS-dependent systems in active conflict zones. With commercial aviation traffic in the affected airspace experiencing this disruption as an unintended but entirely foreseeable side effect of military signal interference operating in the same frequency ranges civilian aviation depends on. Modern aircraft do retain backup navigation systems independent of GPS, including inertial navigation and ground-based radio navigation aids, which means GPS spoofing incidents documented so far haven't directly caused confirmed crashes, but aviation safety experts have expressed genuine, escalating concern about the cumulative risk this represents, particularly regarding flight crew workload and decision-making confusion during the critical period when conflicting navigation data first appears, and about the broader trend of military electronic warfare increasingly bleeding into civilian infrastructure as a documented, growing pattern rather than an isolated anomaly. Story 23: Zombie viruses in melting permafrost, a genuine, documented microbiological risk as Arctic permafrost, ground that has remained continuously frozen for thousands to tens of thousands of years across vast stretches of Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada, thaws at an accelerating rate driven by climate change. Researchers have documented the genuine revival of ancient microorganisms, including viruses, that had remained dormant and frozen for extraordinarily long periods, raising serious scientific questions about what else might emerge as permafrost thaw continues to accelerate. This isn't speculative. French and Russian researchers, led substantially by virologist Jean-Michel Claverie, have successfully revived several so-called giant viruses recovered from Siberian permafrost samples dated to tens of thousands of years old, demonstrating these ancient pathogens retain the capability to infect host cells even after such an extraordinarily extended dormant period. With the most recent confirmed revival involving a virus estimated at approximately 48,500 years old, the oldest virus successfully revived and confirmed infectious in laboratory conditions to date. The specific viruses successfully revived in these published studies have been ones that infect amoebae rather than humans, which the researchers studying them have specifically noted as a deliberate methodological choice that limits the immediate practical danger of the published research itself. But the broader implication these findings point toward is considerably more concerning. If multiple distinct ancient virus types have already been confirmed capable of retaining infectious viability across tens of thousands of years of permafrost preservation, it raises genuine, scientifically serious questions about what other dormant pathogens, potentially including ones capable of infecting humans or livestock, might exist within the vast expanses of permafrost currently thawing across the Arctic. A 2016 anthrax outbreak in Siberia, definitively traced to spores released from a thawing reindeer carcass that had been frozen in permafrost for decades, already provided real-world confirmation that this isn't a purely theoretical concern. It's a documented mechanism that has already caused at least one confirmed outbreak, with the scale of permafrost thaw only accelerating since. Story 24: the quiet build out of total surveillance across the global deep ocean multiple nations, led prominently by the United States and China, but increasingly involving other major naval powers, have been substantially expanding underwater surveillance infrastructure across the world's oceans, building networks of seabed sensors, hydrophone arrays, and other detection systems specifically intended to track submarine movements and other underwater activity at a scale and sophistication that represents a genuinely significant expansion of military surveillance capability, occurring largely outside sustained public or media attention. This infrastructure builds substantially on Cold War-era precedent. The U.S. Navy's SOSUS, Valence System Hydrophone Network, originally developed during the Cold War specifically to track Soviet submarine movements across the Atlantic and Pacific, represents the direct technological ancestor of current systems, but modern deep ocean surveillance networks incorporate significantly more advanced sensor technology, computational analysis capability, and broader geographic coverage than their Cold War predecessors achieved. China has been documented substantially expanding its own underwater surveillance network, particularly across the South China Sea and broader Pacific regions where territorial and military tensions with the United States and regional neighbors remain elevated, with this expansion forming a genuine and significant component of the broader U.S.-China strategic competition that receives considerably more sustained media attention in its more visible dimensions: trade policy, Taiwan tensions, technology export controls, than in this specific underwater infrastructure dimension. The strategic stakes here are genuinely significant, precisely because submarines have historically represented one of the more survivable and difficult to detect components of nuclear deterrence strategy for major nuclear powers. A comprehensive, sufficiently advanced underwater surveillance network that could reliably track adversary submarine movements would represent a meaningful and potentially destabilizing shift in the underlying strategic balance that nuclear deterrence theory has depended on for decades. Since the perceived survivability of submarine-based nuclear forces is a core component of why this deterrence structure has historically been considered stable. This is exactly the kind of genuinely consequential, technically complex strategic development that struggles for sustained public attention relative to its actual long-term significance. Story 25: Antimicrobial Resistance. The slow-motion catastrophe public health officials keep warning about antimicrobial resistance. Bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens evolving resistance to the drugs developed to treat them, with antibiotic resistance specifically being the most significant component, has been repeatedly described by major public health bodies, including the World Health Organization, as one of the top global public health threats, with a frequently cited 2019 study estimating that bacterial antimicrobial resistance was directly associated with approximately 1.27 million deaths globally that year alone, a toll that exceeds malaria and is approaching the global death toll from HIV/AIDS, and yet receives a fraction of the sustained public attention and emergency-level political response those comparison diseases have historically generated. The mechanism driving this crisis is well understood and, in significant part, preventable overuse and misuse of antibiotics, both in human medicine scribing antibiotics for viral infections they have no effect on, or incomplete treatment courses that allow partially resistant bacteria to survive and proliferate, and, even more significantly by volume, in agricultural livestock production, where antibiotics have been routinely used not just to treat illness, but as growth promoters and disease prevention measures across large-scale industrial animal farming, creating enormous selective pressure, favoring the evolution and spread of resistant bacterial strains across environments far beyond hospitals specifically. The pharmaceutical industry pipeline for new antibiotics has also been a documented, persistent problem. New antibiotic development has been comparatively unprofitable relative to other drug categories, since effective new antibiotics are typically used sparingly and held in reserve specifically to delay the emergence of resistance against them, creating a perverse economic incentive structure where the drug society most needs developed are precisely the ones pharmaceutical companies have the least direct financial incentive to invest in. A market failure that public health policy experts have been warning about and proposing alternative funding and incentive models to address for years, with limited structural progress. The genuinely alarming long-term trajectory being warned about by infectious disease specialists is a potential return to a pre-antibiotic era medical reality, where currently routine procedures, surgery, chemotherapy, organ transplantation become substantially riskier due to infection risk, a scenario receiving remarkably limited sustained public urgency relative to its scale. Story 26, the dead internet theory, has quietly become closer to documented reality. What began as a fringe online theory, the claim that an increasingly large proportion of internet content and engagement is artificially generated rather than produced by genuine human users, has, in the years since large language models became widely accessible, transitioned from speculative conspiracy theory towards something considerably closer to a documented, measurable, ongoing trend. Even as the most extreme original versions of the theory involve coordinated government psyop remain unsubstantiated. Multiple independent research efforts and bot detection analyses have documented substantial and apparently growing percentages of total internet traffic and social media engagement originating from automated accounts rather than genuine human users, with some industry analyses placing automated, non-human traffic at a significant proportion of total measured internet activity, a figure that has reportedly increased measurably in recent years as AI text and image generation tools have become more sophisticated and harder to distinguish from genuine human-created content. The genuinely concerning structural risk that researchers in this space have begun documenting and naming specifically is model collapse, a phenomenon in which AI systems, trained on increasingly large datasets scraped from the broader internet, end up training substantially on content that was itself previously generated by earlier AI systems rather than by humans, creating a degrading feedback loop in which each successive generation of AI training data becomes progressively less representative of genuine human language, knowledge, and creative output, with researchers publishing peer-reviewed work specifically modeling and warning about this dynamic. What makes this genuinely under-discussed relative to its actual significance is the gap between casual, often dismissive treatment of dead internet theory as a fringe conspiracy talking point, and the considerably more sober, increasingly well-evidenced academic and industry research documenting genuine, measurable trends toward declining human-generated content proportion and genuine technical risk from AI systems increasingly training on AI-generated material, a problem that compounds the more familiar and already widely discussed issue of AI-generated misinformation with a deeper, structural question about the long-term integrity and authenticity of the internet's underlying content ecosystem. Story 27, the global topsoil countdown. How many harvests are actually left topsoil, the nutrient-rich uppermost layer of soil that the vast majority of global agriculture depends on for crop production, is being lost to erosion, degradation, and unsustainable agricultural practices at a rate that significantly outpaces the extraordinarily slow natural processes required to form new topsoil, which takes, depending on conditions, hundreds to thousands of years to generate even a single centimeter of new fertile soil, creating a genuine long-term sustainability crisis for global food production that receives remarkably limited, sustained public attention relative to its eventual, fundamental implications. A frequently cited UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimate has suggested that, at current global rates of soil degradation, the world may have only several decades of currently farmable topsoil remaining in significant agricultural regions if current practices continue without substantial reform, a figure that has been cited with varying degrees of precision and has generated some methodological debate among soil scientists, but that consistently points in the same genuinely alarming directional trend, regardless of the exact specific timeline. The agricultural practices driving this degradation are well documented and substantially preventable through known alternative methods: intensive monoculture farming, excessive tillage that disrupts soil structure and accelerates erosion, and insufficient use of cover cropping and crop rotation techniques that would otherwise help maintain soil organic matter and structural integrity. All collectively contribute to accelerated topsoil loss well beyond natural background erosion rates, driven substantially by short-term economic pressures within industrial agriculture that favor practices maximizing immediate yield over long-term soil sustainability. Regenerative agriculture practices, including reduced tillage, cover cropping, and more diverse crop rotation systems, have demonstrated genuine, measurable success in slowing or even reversing topsoil degradation in numerous documented pilot programs and increasingly mainstream agricultural adoption. But the structural economic incentives within large-scale industrial agriculture, combined with the issue's fundamentally slow-moving, undramatic nature compared to more acute environmental crises, have kept this genuinely civilization-relevant long-term food security issue from generating anything close to the sustained public attention and policy urgency its eventual stakes would seem to warrant. Story 28: Climate-driven drug-resistant fungal infections are a genuinely new and growing threat. Fungal pathogens have historically posed a relatively limited direct threat to human health compared to bacterial and viral disease, largely because human body temperature has traditionally provided a meaningful natural barrier. Most fungi simply can't survive and thrive at the warm internal temperatures of the human body, which is part of why serious, invasive fungal infections have historically been concentrated mainly among severely immunocompromised patients. Climate change is now measurably eroding this protective barrier in a genuinely concerning and relatively new way. Candida auris, a fungal pathogen first identified in 2009, has emerged and spread globally in a pattern that multiple infectious disease researchers have directly linked to climate change. The leading scientific hypothesis is that rising global temperatures have effectively trained certain fungal species to tolerate higher temperatures than fungi have historically been able to withstand, gradually eroding the thermal protection that human body temperature has traditionally provided against fungal infection, with C. auris specifically demonstrating concerning levels of resistance to multiple existing classes of antifungal medication, sometimes described in the medical literature using the term pan-drug resistant, when a strain shows resistance across essentially all currently available treatment options. The World Health Organization published its first ever priority list of fungal pathogens of public health concern in 2022. A genuinely significant institutional acknowledgement that this category of infectious disease threat has moved from a relatively niche medical concern to a recognized global health priority, explicitly citing climate change as a contributing factor to the emergence and spread of dangerous fungal pathogens, alongside the parallel and increasingly serious problem of antifungal resistance developing through mechanisms similar to antibiotic resistance. Hospital outbreaks of Candida auris, specifically, have been documented across multiple countries, with the pathogen's resistance to standard disinfection protocols and its ability to persist on hospital surfaces for extended periods creating genuine, serious infection control challenges, representing exactly the kind of emerging climate-connected health threat that public health researchers have been actively warning about while receiving relatively limited mainstream public attention, given how directly it connects two already significant, independently under-discussed crises.